How do you trust open source software? Introducing OpenSSF Scorecard. Hi, I'm Naveen Srinivasan. I'm excited to be here at BSidesSF this year. I'm all about open source and supply chain security. I'm a contributor. I contribute to a few open source projects, and I'm one of the maintainers of Scorecard. Brian.
Great. I'm Brian Russell. I'm a product manager on Google's open source security team, and I work a lot with OpenSSF scorecards as well with Naveen. So before we get into the meat of the presentation, we can start with just a fundamental question of really what is trust? You know, we can look at a formal dictionary definition. I tend to think of it as at what level can you feel comfortable about something that you can rest easy, kind of knowing that things are safe and taken care of. When we think about it in terms of how you build trust, we're going to look at it in two different ways. There's kind of the ideal, gradual way of doing that. That's where we can really get to know, a person or an organization over time. By doing that, you start to get to know them. You can really just directly see what's working. Are they doing things that seem safe? Are they doing things that aren't? The issue with that is that scalability is really difficult, especially if you start thinking about in terms of open source software and all the dependencies that go in. There's just no way, you as one person or even a team of people can go out and just meet everybody that basically builds all those dependencies. So let's think about how we could jumpstart that. If we could just find a way to get to know someone, to be able to build some trust up front. One way to do that is really just looking for evidence of how things are operating when it comes to a project. What kind of best practices are they employing? And when we start to do this approach and look at it from an evidence-based perspective, that's something that we can do with really high scalability. We can go out and we can collect that evidence repeatably for all these different projects that we're interested in. So thinking a little bit more in terms of software, what kinds of best practices really start to matter? And you could ask yourself things like, if I had a couple of projects, how would you feel if, one of them was conducting code reviews and another one wasn't? Or one of them has unfixed vulnerabilities? Or one cares about permissioning things in a way that really makes sense for an open source project? And whether or not there's activity or if this project is just sitting there without a lot of people still watching it. So these are the kinds of best practices that you could start to look at project by project. Now, if we think about building that trust in the context of a very specific problem, we start with this block diagram. And this block diagram really represents what modern digital infrastructure looks like when you pull back that first layer. You have a lot of components. Some are big, some are small, some are really well maintained. Others might have one critical point of failure. What you don't really have when you just look at it like this is a lot of insight into what's going on. Only, what really is important for your particular system. So what if we start thinking about evidence, and what if we start thinking about what if we build some insight within these different dependencies? What if we started being able to look at it in a way where you could see that some dependencies are really in great shape, and other dependencies really have a lot of work to do. And, some are doing a pretty good job, but have some room for improvement. It's that kind of insight that we want to think about, tools that we could use to really start building that. And that is really what the OpenSSF Scorecard project was created to do, is to help really collect best practices or evidence thereof in one place such that you can evaluate projects really quickly. So if you want to take a look at a scorecard right now, you can go to this site called deps.dev. Slight disclaimer, since I'm at Google, deps.dev is a Google project, but they are also the biggest consumer of all of our scorecards data. And at the moment, they have the main UX to look at scorecards. So if you navigate there, I encourage you to just think of a project that you use. And if you don't have one off the top of your head, you could just look at the scorecard project itself, do a search for it, click on the project piece. If we have scorecard data for it, you should see it on that project page. And you can start to look at, within those set of best practices, or checks as we call them, what's going well in this project and what could have room for improvement. So to give an example of one particular check, each of these checks have roughly the same kind of structure. You have a title of what it is, a description of what it is, and a risk level associated with it. So in the case of binary artifacts, this is a case where you have binaries actually checked into a source repo, which means that you can't actually see the code behind them. And even if the code is supposed to be in the repo too, there's not that strong link between the two. So what Scorecard does is looks for evidence of that, and then for each binary that it finds, it just, in kind of an Olympic scoring kind of way, starts subtracting from 10 a point for each binary that's found. And that's really what you would see across these different checks. This same kind of basic formula of this is a best practice, and then there's a scoring mechanism under the hood. If you look on the project page, you can start to get more details on how all of those are counted and what really each check means. So at this point, you might be wondering, can I use scorecards if you have a private repo versus a public repo? The answer is yes. Scorecards comes in a few different flavors, but essentially what you can do is run it as a CLI, run it as a GitHub action, or consume the public scorecard data that's already there. What if you use Git but not GitHub? You can use it in a slightly limited way, but those checks are there, and you'll be able to run like the CLI tool to do that. And for fans of GitLab out there, if you have that, stay tuned. That's something that we're working on right now. So a brief note on just what really supply chain security is looking like why scorecards really came about. And then we'll go into some actual demos and kind of go into a little bit more of the mechanics. The long story short, we could pull up more stats than just these, but open source software consumption is growing. It already accounts for a really big chunk of most people's infrastructure or the code that they're shipping, and that volume is only increasing over time. After this presentation is available, you can look a little bit more at what the Linux Foundation found, what's behind these numbers, and what Sonatype published in their annual State of Software Supply Chain Support. But what you see is strong growth, and with that growth, unfortunately, you also see a steep increase in supply chain attacks themselves. So this has become an increasing problem and something that more and more people are starting to look at. This graph comes from Sonatype's annual State of the Software Supply Chain Report. If you have a chance, take a look at it. It will go a lot more in depth into both the problem itself, but also look at how different tools can be used to help mitigate that. And it takes a special look at scorecards in particular as well. So with that, we'll get to some demos, and I'll hand it back to Naveen.
Thanks, Brian. Last year, we launched Scorecard's API, and I want to take this opportunity to go discuss about the API, why we built it, what is the reason, and all that. The API is available at api.securityscorecards.dev. One of the critical things which we made a decision was to provide the data that Scorecard already collects. It collects 1.2 million GitHub scans every week, and all of the data is available as BigQuery, but we spoke to a few customers, and all of them wanted some way of getting it using standard HTTP, so that's one of the critical reasons we built the API. This API does not require any tokens, so anybody should be able to utilize this API. We also made the API predictable, so you can hear in the in the curl command, you can see it's Kubernetes. Kubernetes that you should be able to replace with any of the, hopefully the 1.2 million GitHub scans that we do. The question then comes, what if a repository is not being scanned? We will have answers for that as we proceed further. But this is the way. This is one of the reasons which we built this API. It's a standard REST API. It does get and post, but right now I'm going to focus on get. But I will, as the demo goes on, we will show why we use post for and how we're using this. Like I mentioned, what is this API serving? It's serving 1.2 million GitHub weekly scans. So Scorecard team runs Scorecard on 1.2 million GitHub repositories, collects the data, and when you hit the API, you get those scans. So essentially, you can make decisions based on that. We launched this API late fall last year. We are seeing about 200,000 requests, not too much, but this is running as public service, so anybody should be able to utilize this. Who's using the API? We don't know who's using the API. So if you're using the API, please come and talk to us. We would love to hear for what you're using for. Here in this example, we saw somebody open an issue. They were trying to ask whether do we have any rate limiting. Right now, we don't enforce any rate limiting explicitly, but don't DDoS this. So what can we do with this API? What you see here right now is a pie chart diagram of specifically of one of the checks called code review. Code review is one of the most critical checks in the State of Supply Chain Security report. What we decided is, how cool will it be to use the API to decide how the top 1,000 critical projects are? I'll talk about what the 1,000 critical projects are. So we pulled the top 1,000 critical projects, use the API, pull the data of them, and we wanted to see how they are performing. And we can see in this, but most of them are doing well, but a few of them need some help. Coming back to specifically critical projects, there's another OpenSSF project called Criticality Score. It specifically measures the criticality of any given project based on an algorithm Rob Pike built. And the cool thing about that is you can use it for your own needs. All this data is available free, and you should be able to tweak your criticality based on your own parameters. It has configuration to go utilize that. So we use that to go build this, essentially using the API. Okay. Enough with all the talk. Can you show me the code, please? I don't want to bore with code over here. So the code is on my personal GitHub repo, so you should be able to clone it, use this. It's written in Go. Scorecard is written in Go. I'm familiar with Go, but you should be able to utilize any modern programming language to pull this. It's a pretty simple project. Let's talk about the usefulness of this API. I am going to be the contributor.
And I will be a security maintainer for a project.
I want to submit a new PR with a dependency, Brian.
I mean, that sounds pretty reasonable, but is this dependency really healthy?
Would a scorecard be helpful, Brian?
If I knew what that was, I might be able to tell you.
Have you checked out the scorecards repository, Brian?
Well, now that I have, this is great. In fact, I think I'm going to use this API for checking all future dependencies. In fact, I think I might add it to my CI/CD workflow tool. And also, it's just so easy to use. It makes me wonder, why doesn't everyone use this at this point?
Thanks, Brian. So we decided to build this as another GitHub action. It's still a work in progress feature, which we are working on. What you can see over here is if you add any new dependency, it'll come back and give you a score, and that can help you decide whether you want to add or whatever you want to do, reject the PR, but it does not. But this is what we are trying to work towards. And the whole idea behind this is you should be able to utilize the API to make your own decisions, and that's the whole idea behind this. Next is, we also launched last year an OpenSSF Scorecards badge. What is the idea of the badges? The badges is for the project repository owners to showcase what is the score for their repositories. It's for consumers to come and see that. That's the basic idea behind this. This in turn uses the API. So if you run the scorecards GitHub action, it uses the API to post the data. So that's why if you bring up a new repository and the repository does not, we are not scanning it, you should be able to use the GitHub action, install it, run it, and you should be able to start getting your scores. So that's another way to get scores populated into Scorecards API. So we want to take an example, and Brian was, we didn't want to fumble in front of everybody to install the demo. Brian was thankful enough to help us make this. So we just pre-canned recorded it. So hopefully it should show us how it's not pretty hard. So if you go to Scorecards repository, specifically scroll down to the section of how to get the badge, we have given it something that you can copy it. So you should be able to navigate to your README and paste it and change only two things: the owner and the repository. The moment you change that and commit that in, you should be able to see those badges for the repository. Like I mentioned, the critical thing for this is the data should be available in the Scorecards API. If I only have 30 seconds, go to deps.dev. That should be able to provide you Scorecards data. If you have 5 minutes, run the Scorecards CLI. If you have 15 minutes, install the GitHub action, add a badge to your repository. Just an FYI, if you use a private repository, if you don't want to share your data, we have that option not to share, so you don't have to share your data with Scorecards API. If you have more than a day, incorporate the API into your workflow.
So to close this out, I just want to say a few words about the organization in which this scorecard is being developed. The OpenSSF has a number of different projects, but it's an organization that is really meant to bring a whole bunch of different people together that have a vested interest in trying to make open source software more secure. So it has a variety of different members that have come together under it to really work towards making open source, as safe as any software as you could have. So participation is very open. There are a number of different ways to really engage with the OpenSSF and see not just the Scorecards project, but a number of other projects that are really critical towards securing open source software. Some of them are here. There is also kind of the one catch-all page, which is openssf.org/getinvolved, where you can get all those links on the last slide. So I think we're at the close at this point, and I'd just like to thank you all for coming. I know, especially end of the day talk, I appreciate everybody that really came out at that point. We'll go to questions.
Great. Thank you, guys. Let's go into Q&A mode. Do I have any questions out here? I'll be on my way. I'll meet you.
Thank you. Saku is here. My question is around, first of all, amazing job. Like we are going through this dependency hell, I would say. But are you having roadmap also some automation around updating, let's say, to new releases and so forth?
That's a great question.
Thank you.
In terms of I think you're asking about, are there ways to automate fixes based on the findings of scorecards? So that would definitely be an extension of where it's at today. At the moment, we're still very focused on detection and making people aware so that they can go in and make the fixes. It's not to say we wouldn't ever enter into that, but in the moment, it's not on the immediate roadmap. Go ahead.
Thank you. That's what I thank you.
Great. We have 5 more minutes. Does anyone else have any questions? Coming around. I'm going to go up and then down to you, if that's okay. Coming right at you.
The work in progress feature you mentioned to post on PRs when a new dependency is introduced seems really awesome and will work really well for those of us who work at companies where there's a massive monorepo, things like that. How can we get updates about when this is introduced? And I'm also really interested in the, the point about when we do dependency version upgrades, are we downgrading actually, perhaps security-wise? Can we know that via a PR comment?
Absolutely. That's a very valid concern. You should be able to. I can go back to that. I'm sorry. The reason I'm going back is you should be able to follow this PR thread, and you should be able to. I'm the PR owner, so hopefully in the next few weeks I should be able to merge this in and get it working. But if you follow this PR thread, we will do that. And also, like what Brian mentioned, if you follow the OpenSSF from Twitter to everything, there will be a release with that being in a blog post. So you should be able to utilize that information. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, coming down to our next question.
Yeah, so what was the process for coming up with all the things on the scorecard, and how do you see that changing in the future, if that will evolve?
Sure. So it's a great question. When you have a whole bunch of different best practices, who's really to say, these are the right best practices? Initially, we started out with just things where a broad group of people who was working on this project universally said, yes, that would roughly increase my trust in a project. I don't think there was a super rigorous methodology. It also predates my time of working on the project. But the starter set was really just, people who had worked in the space for a while, had been thinking about the problem for a while, came together and basically said, I think this is a good set. If we knew these things, that would help influence decisions about whether or not we would want to use this project. I hope that answers the question.
Do I see any further questions coming over? There you are.
Just as a follow-up to what was asked, what is the process for adding a new, line item?
That's a config. That's a config setting for that. You mean for the?
He means checks.
Like a new metric.
New metric. You mean a new metric. So, for that, you gotta create an issue. We have a discussion, and then we go about doing it. So it's like any other new feature on any other open source project that you want to do. You come back and specifically give us why, how, and then you should be able to go ahead and get that working.
Yeah, the short answer is come talk to us. Go to the Get Involved page and join meetings, open PRs. All those will start the right discussions.
We have time for one more question. Okay. Well, thank you guys for being here today. On behalf of BSidesSF and DoyenSec, I would like to present you with these gifts from our sponsor, DoyenSec. And thank you so much, guys, for wrapping it up today. Thank you. Let's give them a round of applause.
Thank you.